Lesson 35, Use Context. 1. Introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, today we explore a key feature of React, the ability to share data deeply through a component tree without having to thread properties through every level. The hook we are focusing on enables a component to read and subscribe to a context. This empowers us with a mechanism to provide values at a higher level of the tree and consume them at any level beneath. 2. What this hook does. At its core, the hook allows you to access the current value of a given context. You take the context you previously defined and ask React to give you its current value in the component where you call the hook. The hook not only fetches the value, but sets up a subscription so that if the value changes, your component will automatically update. In other words, your component remains in sync with the context's value as the application evolves. 3. How the value is determined. When you call this hook in a component, React looks up the component tree to find the nearest provider for that context. The value returned to your component is the value that the provider above it supplies. If there is no provider in the tree above your component, then the hook returns the default value that was specified when the context was created. Because of that, it is important to make sure the provider sits above any component that consumes the context. 4. Common usage scenarios. There are several practical situations where this hook is useful. When you need to pass data from a top-level component deeply into many nested children without passing the data explicitly through each intermediate component. When that shared data may change over time, such as a theme setting, a user's authentication status, or global settings. In those cases, when the shared value changes, you want all consuming components to reflect that change. When you wish to override context for a part of the component tree, you might provide one value in one branch of the tree, and then inside that branch provide a different value for a narrower subtree. 5. Fallback, default value behavior. If you forget to place a provider above a consumer, the hook still returns the default value that the context was initialized with. While that may prevent a runtime error, it might not be the intended behavior. It's therefore a good practice to set a meaningful default value when creating the context, so that in exceptional or testing scenarios the consumers still have something sensible to fall back on. 6. Performance considerations. Using context comes with some subtle performance implications. When the context value changes, any component that uses the hook for that context will re-render. This means if you pass objects or functions as the context value, even if the underlying meaningful data hasn't changed, but the object or function reference changed, React will consider it a new value and trigger re-rendering. To avoid unnecessary updates, you should ensure the value passed into the provider is stable, for example by reusing the same object reference if possible or using memoization techniques. 7. Troubleshooting common pitfalls. There are several usual errors to look out for. One is forgetting to wrap the consumer component in a provider above it. Without the correct hierarchy, the hook will see only the default value or undefined. Another is that you may accidentally render the provider inside the same component that consumes the context. In this case, the consumer won't see the intended provided value because the provider must be above it in the tree, not inside the same render where consumption happens. Also, ensure that the context object you are using in the provider and the one you are consuming are the exact same instance. If your build or tooling duplicates modules, for example due to symlinks, you might end up with two different context objects with the same name, and thus the provider and the consumer are mismatched. Finally, if a provider is present, but you pass no value prop, or the wrong prop name, then the hook will see undefined rather than the intended value. 8. Summary. In summary, the hook enables components to consume context values, it subscribes them to updates, and it relies on the context provider being hierarchically above. It is an elegant pattern for sharing data deeply across a component tree without prop drilling. However, like all powerful tools, It requires attention to structure, value stability, and hierarchy if you want to avoid performance issues or unexpected behavior. 9. Closing remarks. As you work with this feature, think of it less as a shortcut and more as a structured way to model shared state or services within your component architecture. Use providers deliberately, keep the values stable and consistent, and design your tree so that consumers are always within scope of the correct provider. Mastering this will help your components be cleaner, more modular, and easier to maintain. Thank you.